I was going to go ahead and get started by introducing Jeff Hammerbacher here for our first talk of the morning. And I need to begin by saying that it is actually a great honor to be able to introduce Jeff Hammerbacher. And it's also one of the more fun things I've been able to do, one of my more fun assignments in the past couple of weeks, because he's really quite an unusual guy. He began his career at Harvard, where he finished an undergraduate degree in mathematics. And then, like so many bright mathematics undergraduates, he came here to the city, actually, and worked as a quantitative analyst, or a quant, as the lingo goes, at Bear Stearns. But after a relatively short period, about a year, he grew weary of that and was invited to go to a little-known, very small startup enterprise called Facebook. He was a very early employee there. And he was charged with a very interesting and specific task, which really, I think, has probably colored his career since then, and will form some of the background to what he'll tell us today. The job was pretty much to take note of the fact that users at Facebook were doing something which had not been seen previously in the history of the internet, and that is they were putting in data on their own, putting in content at an exponentially increasing rate. That was different than a lot of the way data had been aggregated on the net so far, and that users were doing it. And Jeff was brought there to conceive, design, and lead a data team to make sense of that data and understand how it could be used. He did that for quite a few years, and then in 2008, basically, I think, got the itch to look at other types of data and to take some of the learnings from Facebook and apply them at other organizations and other industries and other disciplines. So he actually founded a company called Cloudera, where he is currently founder and chief scientist. And he's been working to deploy the sort of infrastructure he developed at Facebook across many industries, from healthcare to everything else. Even more recently, he's gotten into healthcare data and biological data and genomic data by accepting an appointment here at our Institute for Genomics and Multiscale Biology as an assistant professor. Along the way, he has been teaching a course in data science at the University of California, Berkeley, not a shoddy computer science department. And in addition to that, is really just generally regarded as one of the foremost data scientists in the world today. So I'm going to close my opening remarks by saying, going to a little bit of a personal anecdote. And that is, I actually first met Jeff in 2008. And we had a little problem we were trying to solve, and it was sort of a Merck Pharmaceuticals problem, sort of an industry problem, sort of a genomics research problem. And that is that most of the genomic data sets that had been generated in the world at that time were somewhat locked down. They were stranded assets, if you will, that had been created for a specific purpose at a specific time, oftentimes within a specific organization, and were not accessible for mining, exploration by anyone other than the people who had created them. And so we gathered a group of some pharmaceutical executives, a bunch of established systems biology and biology professors, some software executives, a few venture capitalists, and Jeff in Seattle. It was either, I think, late 2008, early 2009, to explore what we could do about this problem. And it was truly an innovative, innovation-needed kind of problem, because everyone realized that we had this issue, and no one knew how we were going to solve it. And one of the prescriptions for doing this is to get a diverse group of people together so that you can actually understand problems well and get different perspectives. And I think what emerged from that is that Jeff's perspective, partly by virtue of his training, partially by the virtue of the fact that his experience was so divergent from everyone else's, was probably, I think, widely acknowledged to be the most valuable in that room. And the real reason I'm mentioning this actually is for the students in the audience, because Jeff at the time probably was, I'm almost certain, the youngest in that room, and was able to make really, really valuable contributions to an enterprise that eventually became Sage Bionetworks, which is an operating concern out in Seattle these days. So without any further long-winded remarks, I'm going to begin to welcome Jeff here for our talk on innovation and data, which is, of course, very germane to what we all do. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. And thanks, everyone, for having me. Especially thanks to Ken and Dennis for taking a chance on me. The last time I worked for an institution in New York, as Andrew mentioned, it disappeared in 2 years. So pretty certain that's not going to happen to Mount Sinai. But in any case, okay. So Andrew did a good job of outlining how I ended up here. So I just wanted to make sure that I went over that before I jumped into what I hope to be doing to assist with the cause of innovation here at Mount Sinai, just so you guys can try and understand why there's someone with very little background in biology and medicine trying to explain to you how to innovate in biology and medicine. So as Andrew mentioned, after my short stint on Wall Street, I landed at Facebook, and we had very little infrastructure for data storage analysis, and it was a really large task to build out that infrastructure from essentially 0 petabytes of data per day to being able to store several petabytes of data up to hundreds of petabytes of data since I've left. And throughout that process, we did a few things. One of the things we did was accidentally coin a new term called data science, which has turned into an actual profession and sort of called my bluff on how I felt that people weren't being prepared very well for the work that we wanted to do at Facebook. We also turned out some open source software projects. So Apache Hadoop and Apache Hive were software projects that we contributed to and created respectfully. At Facebook, and eventually became foundations for what we built at Cloudera. And then Apache Cassandra was a project that we built in our group as well, and that's actually spun off and become a company of its own. So there's a company called DataStax, which is commercializing that software product, and has raised almost $50 million in funding without ever speaking to those of us who were part of the creation. So that's been very interesting to watch. At Cloudera, we've been commercializing a lot of the infrastructure that we built for a lot of the open source software that we built for data storage analysis at Facebook. And it's been an interesting ride. It's about 4 years old as a company, a little over 300 employees, several hundred customers, about 13 different offices worldwide. So that's been a really fun project to get off the ground, and it's taught me a lot about entrepreneurship in addition to data management. And in the course of building out Cloudera, I recognized, as I mentioned, that this whole data science thing was turning into something real, and I'd better hurry up and explain to people what I meant when I said it. So I set about teaching, putting together a curriculum for what we call data science and teaching it at the University of California, Berkeley for a few years. And so I got a taste of academia there. So that was part of what drew me over to Mount Sinai, was the opportunity to continue my work in teaching. But the other half was research. And as Andrew mentioned, I started to learn a lot more about the variety of challenges present in the biomedical domain through my work with Sage Bionetworks. And they were kind enough to make me an offer to be a director there. And it's been a really fascinating project to be involved in for the last several years. So I just wanted to say a few things about what I've learned. So Scott instructed me to spend a third of this talk on what I've done and 2/3 on what I plan to do. So here's the third of what I've done. I'm going to try and run through it very quickly. So things that I've learned from a data perspective. Number one, instrument everything. It's very, very important to measure every single thing that's happening, all the way, if you're talking about Facebook, all the way from what's happening in the user's browser through to how the data gets transmitted from the user's browser to our data center, and then all the way through the different software projects which it's working its way through inside of the data center. And you can't, most of the problems that I've encountered when you end up attempting to diagnose it, you find that you did not instrument enough to be able to diagnose it completely. And so every problem you encounter usually ends up with a follow-up exercise of instrumentation. So you enter into this iterative cycle of instrumenting deeper and deeper and deeper into what you've built. And I hope that we can bring some of that philosophy into the medical domain. I also learned it's very important to invest in infrastructure. So you can't just hire a bunch of these data scientists, bring them into your organization, and expect them to get work done. So I was actually hired, my original title was research scientist at Facebook, and they wanted me to do research on how user behavior was changing based on new features that we were rolling out. And I couldn't do that research because we had absolutely no infrastructure for storing the data. So I spent 2.5 years at Facebook building out the infrastructure to do the research that I had hoped to do when I was hired in the first place. And now, actually, they have almost 80 people focused entirely on building out that infrastructure for data analysis at Facebook. So it's really key not just to invest in the people who do the data analysis, but also to invest in the people who build out the infrastructure to enable that data analysis. I also think it's very important to put all of your data in one place. There are all kinds of great things that happen when you have a variety of different data sets which land in a single place. I think it's very important to start storing data immediately. Don't worry about which questions you're going to ask of that data, because your questions often change based on what you find in the data. And the same goes for how you structure your data. It's very important to just start storing it and to discover the structure present, rather than spending months or years debating over the optimum file format for this particular sequencing device or that particular microarray. I also think it's absolutely important to keep raw data forever. I go to too many places where you're just throwing out what you know about your customers and what you know about your patients simply due to the fact that it costs a lot of money to store it and you don't have any tools which can actually extract the information from that data. But the reality is I often say that data is an intermediate representation of science, and if you don't have the data, you can't do science. And that's what many of us here at Mount Sinai are focused on. So I think it's very important, that the cost of a gigabyte of data today is around 4 cents, the raw cost of a hard drive to store that. So it's really hard for me to believe that we can't afford to keep all of the raw data forever in most organizations. And then once you've stored all that data, it's very important that you let everyone party on that data, as Jim Gray liked to say. So don't just let the scientists work on it, but also let the executives, let the product managers, let the salespeople, let everyone who has questions to ask the data find their own way to interrogate that data and learn what is present inside of it. And it's very important also, as Jim Gray would say, to produce tools which support the entire research cycle. So it's very often the case that when people build out these data infrastructure projects, the primary investment of capital goes into the container into which you put that data, and then the software tools that are used to analyze the data. But all the tools which are then built by the analysts to prepare the data and to communicate the data back to different end users don't get nearly as much of an investment of capital. So I think you can't just invest in the container, you have to invest in the tools around it. So that's what I've learned about data. It's probably not as interesting to those of you who don't work with data on a day-to-day basis. So here's what I've learned about innovation from being a part of two very rapidly growing startups and one very rapidly decaying Wall Street bank. So one of the things that was, I had a very enlightening conversation once with an early Facebook executive where I sat down with him and I asked him, do you think we'll ever be like Google and we'll have offices all over the world and engineers working out of them? And he turned to me and he said, well, we'd love to have every great engineer in the world working for Facebook, but we just don't want to have to pay their salary. And it was very enlightening, because if you look at a lot of what Facebook has done from a product strategy perspective, the Facebook platform, which enabled third-party companies to build on top of the Facebook product, grew out of this desire to make the world work for Facebook. And if you look at what they've done from an infrastructure perspective, you see the same philosophy reflected. So all the software that we built out for data storage and analysis was open source. And because it was an open source project, we received contributions not just from employees of Facebook, but also employees of a large number of other institutions. So those are all people who were not on my payroll, but they were making my infrastructure better. And I thought that was very enlightening. And in fact, Facebook's taken a remarkable step of not just making their software open source, but since I've left, they've made the designs for their data centers and even their servers open source. So you can go and download a CAD file which describes how individual Facebook servers are designed and laid out, and then you can order that server to be running your infrastructure. So I think it's very important to think about not just the people that you employ within your particular organization, but also the people who are external to that organization, and how you can align their interests with yours and enable them to work for you. Probably the most important thing I learned, though, is if you want to innovate, you need to lower your batch size. And there's a great story that demonstrates this. So there's in the 1950s or so, there was a prize put out by a UK businessman who wanted to figure out if it was possible to build a plane which could be powered by human beings alone. And so for decades, people attempted to build a plane which would be powered by human beings alone, by a single human being alone. And it turns out that people would spend all this money up front on research and come up with a theory about how to build this plane. Take them years to build the plane, they try and fly it, and it would just crash. And until one day, several decades later, after the challenge was issued, a scientist said, you know what, people are solving the wrong problem. The right problem to be solving is, I need to build a plane which can be reconstructed immediately upon crash, or as fast as possible after crashing, so that I can speed through that iteration cycle more rapidly. And so this guy spent a lot of time figuring out how to build a plane out of like PVC and plastic and things like that. And of course, it didn't work on his first try. But the thing was, when the plane broke, he was able to get back up, put it back together, try out a new idea. And oftentimes, he would try out 2 or 3 new ideas in a single day. And within a few months, he was able to build a plane which could be powered by a single human being alone. And so the most important lesson there was to just make it build that harness for innovation. Make it easy to try something new and then to fail quickly and then to get something else slightly better out there. And that was something that we worked on a lot at Facebook. We often said move fast and break things was part of our motto. And in the web domain, there's something called continuous deployment. So if you have a new change you'd like to make to the website, you have an entire harness, and at Facebook this was called Gatekeeper, which you would basically say, here's a change I'd like to roll out to some people. And Gatekeeper would automate rolling that out to a very small set of people, figuring out if it worked okay on that small set of people, and then broadening it up little by little until it had reached the entire population. And it was all done in a quantitative fashion, and we had standard procedures for rollback, and et cetera. And this sort of continuous deployment infrastructure is something that I think that the medical domain could benefit from greatly. I see a tremendous amount of focus put into that upfront vetting of whether or not, for example, a new medication should be unleashed on the world. But once it has been unleashed, there's not that incremental rollout. It's sort of there's a lot of these smaller stages, and then boom, it just hits the rest of the world. And then you have things like Vioxx, which have to be discovered through less controlled means. And so I think that the more you can do to build that harness for innovation so that people can try new things out but very rapidly roll back when they don't work and move on to something which might be slightly better very quickly is probably the most important thing that I learned about how to make innovation happen. So whatever you can do to lower the batch size, the better off you're going to be. And I also think that focusing on your ultimate outcomes was a great lesson to learn while at Facebook. So it can be very distracting at times to look at things like intermediate outcomes, based on maybe what your competitors are doing, or based on something you'd like to achieve on a year or two time scale. But if you remain focused on a very small set of outcomes on a very long time scale, which are very important to your organization, then I think you make progress against those goals much more rapidly than if you're paying attention to kind of the noise of what's happening around you. So the lesson that I learned at Facebook was, we never looked at competitors in the social networking space. We really only looked at companies like Google as people that we perceived as trying to build something with the scope and scale that we were attempting to build. And we always knew what we were trying to optimize for. We knew that we were building a utility. We weren't building something which was a shiny entertainment place. So whereas some people might have been frightened when they saw celebrities using something like MySpace heavily, we understood that wasn't what we were building, so we weren't distracted. So I think it's very important for an organization to really understand deeply, and every single person in that organization to understand deeply what it is that that organization is trying to accomplish. At Cloudera, we go through something called the Mission Strategy Objectives exercise every quarter, and I think it's really important to get that mission embedded in the head of every single person in the organization. And the most innovative people that I've seen in an organization are the people who deeply understand the ultimate outcome that the organization is attempting to accomplish, and they view it through the lens of their particular responsibilities. And so they're able to identify in the projects that they're working on something which would allow the organization to achieve its ultimate outcome based on what they're doing and the skills that they have. So I think it's very, very important to have a small set of ultimate outcomes that you're seeking as an organization, and then embed those outcomes within the minds of everyone in the organization, and then enable them to innovate. And one of the most important things that I see people doing wrong within organizations is they think about innovation from the organization out rather than the people of the organization up. And so I call this problem role design. So it's the most innovative projects that I've been involved with, for example, that Apache Cassandra project, which is now tens of millions of dollars funded startup, that project grew out of looking at one of my employees in my group at Facebook and recognizing that he wasn't happy with the project that he was working on, and he had this great idea for another project that he was working on. And while it wasn't precisely what I wanted to accomplish with our team, I recognized that he was going to be able to move a lot faster if he was working on something that he loved and that he genuinely had a great idea for. So if you can sit down with the individuals that you have in your organization and recognize the people who truly have a vision and empower them to achieve that vision, even if it might deviate slightly from what the organization as a whole is attempting to accomplish, I think that innovation happens much faster. Hacking is a deeply held belief within the Facebook team. In fact, they've in their new offices, they've built a giant sign that says hack, which is visible from airplanes which are flying over. And so this hacking philosophy basically means if something breaks, it's your job to understand why it broke and to be able to repair it, and to just be curious. Whenever and to also to just if you're interested in something, take it apart. I'll never forget. There was one day I was staying late at the office, and there was a couple of these guys that were about 19 15 years old at the time, and the Apple TV had just come out. And they went down to the Apple store, they bought one of the first Apple TVs, and then in the office that night, they reverse engineered it, figured out how to make it play arbitrary video files. And then they uploaded that video to the internet, and the next day, you know, our chief of security was basically like, you know, never do that again. The FBI is literally going to arrest us. And he used to work at the FBI, so he knew what he was talking about. But it was just really cool to be in an office where, you know, people wanted to stay late and take apart a device and make it work and to do the things they wanted it to do. And I was just very inspired by those individuals and being around them. And then the most important thing is, you know, it was constantly messaged to all of us that our job was to be revolutionary at Facebook. And unless you're telling people on a daily basis that, you know, we're not attempting to make incremental change, we're trying to lead a revolution, then I don't think that you're going to get that innovation that you'd like. So on that note, being revolutionary, one of the things that drew me to Mount Sinai was a guy named Eric Schott, probably the thing that drew me to Mount Sinai. So Eric wrote an article a couple years ago, and the title of it was "Genomic Advances of the 2000s Will Demand an Informatics Revolution of the 2010s." So hey, revolution, I'm here. Sounds fun. And when I was very curious, I was excited to give this talk, but I was also surprised to be asked. And when I was talking to Scott about what the things that he'd hoped me to talk about, he said, well, you know, our primary goal is to sensitize ourselves to your phenotype. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So I'm going to try and just be myself and what I'm attempting to accomplish at Mount Sinai, I'm going to bring the same set of eyes and the same set of hands that I brought to the previous two organizations I was involved with, and hopefully it works out. You know, I'm sure I'm going to break a few eggs along the way, and feel free to give me feedback if I'm putting my foot in my mouth. But I'm going to do my best over the next couple years to help lead this, or at least enable this revolution here at Mount Sinai. So there's if we're going to have a revolution about data, I should probably have some data in my slides, so here we go. So I looked at over a few of these kind of high-level market research reports. You know, you guys probably roll your eyes as much as I do when you read these things, but they're the best we have, so here goes. So Frost & Sullivan did a research report on the U.S. hospital health data analytics market, which is probably closest to what I wanted to learn about, and probably the most realistic. And one of the key figures that stood out to me was they said in 2011 only 10% of U.S. hospitals use health data analytic tools, but they expect by 2016 that number is going to grow to 50%. So I've already looked around inside of Mount Sinai and seen a number of uses of health data analytics tools. So I'm excited to have joined one of those hospitals that's in that 10%. But I think it's very important to recognize that, you know, in the S-curve of innovation adoption, we're still at the bottom, and we're going to be ramping through that very steep part of the S over the next 5 years. So I think it's going to be important to have as many people as we can with my phenotype helping guide the space through that ramp of innovation. There was another report by Oracle called From Overload to Impact about the impact of big data and on healthcare. And one of the numbers that they cited was that 100% of healthcare executives say their organization is collecting and managing more business information today than it was 2 years ago. So literally a uniform problem, and the average increase was 85%. So in other words, over the course of 2 years, the average increase was basically doubling. And that's about what I've seen. About a year and a half to 2 years is the time span for doubling the amount of data within the enterprise. So if you start extrapolating that out, doubling every year and a half, then you recognize that on the order of a decade, you're going to have quite a large data management problem to deal with. They also found in the survey that 47% of healthcare executives said their organization could not interpret and translate their information into actionable insight. So that's probably the other side of that 50% figure from Frost & Sullivan, I suppose. And then McKinsey kind of made the most outrageous claims. They felt that big data was going to deliver $333 billion of potential annual value to U.S. healthcare, and $165 billion of that 333 was going to come in clinical operations. So even more value could be delivered in clinical operations of the hospital, they felt, than in research and development. So that was exciting to me, and part of what drew me to Mount Sinai was the relationship between the clinic and the research labs. So for the next 2 years, I hope to, first of all, understand and enable a data infrastructure for performing data analysis. So as I mentioned earlier, that's one of my things that I learned from Facebook is that you need to invest early and heavily in data infrastructure, and then downstream you'll reap those rewards through data analysis. So, you know, I've seen already some well-managed infrastructure for data analysis. So Epic and the Epic reporting system, the Mount Sinai data warehouse is well constructed, and then, you know, very quickly, I've been amazed at how rapidly Patricia and Zach and their team have been able to bring online Minerva for enabling research. So I think that these are all really excellent foundations to build on. So I'd love to learn more about how they work and to help them out in any way. And then I think building out an infrastructure using some of the software tools and techniques that we've proved out at Facebook and then enhanced at Cloudera is something that I hope to bring an additional capability to Mount Sinai in addition to the existing infrastructure. So I've seen a couple of very interesting projects around data visualization. So Hugh Dye and his group have built some quality dashboards, which are very cool. And I've already seen a cool app that Joel Dudley built out for genome visualization on an iPad. And this is an area that I've spent quite a bit of time myself, and I hope to build out, find more data sets and bring them to light and enable people to interact with them. There's a very interesting predictive analytics project called PACT to predict readmission to the hospital that's already integrated back into the electronic medical record inside of Epic, and that's very, very cool. Not only has predictive analytics been used, but it's actually been integrated in an operational system. So I think that that's a degree of maturity that I don't even see in a lot of our customers at Cloudera. So I'm excited to find other uses for predictive analytics and integrate those into the operational infrastructure. And then finally, having put this course together and taught it 2 times now, I feel very comfortable with trying to bring an upper-level undergraduate computer science student into the tools and techniques that I know and love in term data science. But I'm excited to actually teach some of the doctors here at Mount Sinai a lot of the same tools. I know that there's already great education in things like bioinformatics, so hopefully this can help augment the curriculum. And love to be able to teach that next school year. Of course, I'm also trying to take classes myself, so I'll have to find some time on that. So that's what I hope to accomplish in a concrete way over the next 2 years. So now I'm going to kind of speculate about the future a little bit. So this is an innovation conference, and I think innovation, one of my experiences in performing innovations is it feels like you're not moving at all on the time scale of a year or two, and then it feels like you're moving, and then you look back over the course of about 5 to 10 years and you say, whoa, that all happened really quickly. And so this is the kind of things that I'm hoping that over the course of kind of 5 to 10 years we can make happen. So in addition to the web domain, where I've spent a lot of my time, the places where I draw inspiration and where I think that we're going to learn a lot about how the future will be shaped by data. So Moneyball represents how I think sports are using data to get better. 538, Nate Silver, represents to me how quantitative social sciences are demonstrating to us how to use data to get better. And LHC is the Large Hadron Collider. And I've seen, I think I've seen the future in terms of multi-thousand-person scientific projects and how they collaborate. And in fact, there's a guy down at NYU who's shown me some of the most mind-blowing software that I've seen in terms of allowing 1,000 scientists to collaborate on a single probability distribution. So these people are going to lead the way, and not my old colleagues from financial services, unfortunately. So in financial services, they were attempting to innovate in model complexity. They would hire people like me with math degrees, and they put us in a room with a whiteboard. We didn't get to touch computers. We didn't get to touch the actual instruments that were being traded. And our whole goal was to just increase the complexity of the models that we were using to evolve the time series of instrument prices. And I think that was a really bad investment of capital in terms of quantitative expertise. And I think what you're seeing in sports and in quantitative social sciences and in high-energy physics and large-scale science projects is going to be much more representative of what the next 10 years are going to hold for how data works. So I think we're going to be working with more data sources. We're going to be adding more rows of data. We're going to be adding more columns of data, new measurements and new features that we calculate. Better data quality is very important. So better data quality, I have a quick anecdote on that. So you guys may have heard of the Heritage Health Prize, which is a predictive analytics contest where they've made a data set available about hospital readmissions, and people are attempting to predict likelihood for readmission to the hospital using that data set. And one of the very early leaders of the Heritage Health Prize competition was someone who had done very little innovation on the model, but he had just gone through and he identified things like male patients who were marked as being pregnant. And so he found all these data quality errors, he fixed them, and he was able to predict readmission better than most of the people who'd built these very complex models. So in my experience, better data quality can have as much or more of an impact on the quality of your predictive models as the sophistication of the model that you've built. Better outcomes, I think, is also very, very important. And I think the Moneyball case illustrates this best. So if you look at the outcomes that they used to measure about baseball, it was batting average. And people recognize that, wait a second, batting average doesn't weight home runs more heavily than singles. So they evolved to look at slugging percentage as an outcome measure for a batter. But then they recognize that well, this doesn't take into account walks, and walks are a way to get on base as well. So they started looking at on-base percentage plus slugging percentage as a measure. But then people started to realize, well, what we actually want to look at is runs generated, not actually just this on-base plus slugging percentage measure. So they started building ways to calculate, well, actually, what's the impact in our models on the runs that you could generate? And that was the outcome measure they attempted to optimize for. And then people realized, well, the A's started having all these guys like Matt Stairs in their outfield who were kind of big, fat, and slow, and they were really terrible at defense. They said, oh, wait a second, we need to not just capture runs generated on offense, but also runs saved on defense. And so they generated these metrics called like wins above replacement. And so there's been this constant evolution over the last 5 to 10 years. It's happening very rapidly in terms of what are the outcome measures that we're actually trying to predict with our data. And I don't see, that's something that I see in a lot of quantitative social science disciplines. Another one that I see is quality of teachers. So people have really focused on what is the metric that you want to put on a teacher to determine that they're actually a better teacher than someone else. And so there's something called the value-added score, which has been evolved over the last couple of years. So I think that a lot of people, rather than focusing on better models, are going to be focused on more accurate outcome measures which actually reflect what we're trying to optimize. Better loss functions, for example, I need to weight there's one project that I've spoken with people about in terms of when do you call in the Stop Sepsis team here in the hospital. And you need to weight a false positive differently from a false negative. So you need to define your loss function to better capture your needs as an organization. So all these things are ways to improve your predictive modeling without actually improving model complexity. I also think causal inference and observational studies is incredibly important in rapidly developing discipline. And healthcare is actually the place where I've seen some of the best work on this. So I don't know that I'm going to bring this as much as I think it's going to be very, very important in the future. So for many interventions, we don't control the assignment to treatment or control groups. And we need to have tools, so we can't just throw up our hands and say there's no way to get evidence out of that. We need to figure out ways to make strong claims from observational studies. And this is something which I think frightens a lot of people, but I think it's something that the statistics have evolved enough in the past couple decades that we should be able to do this. Focusing on effect size estimates rather than statistical significance and performing meta-analyses, which combine the results of many analyses, I think are very, very important techniques that need further investment. So 538 is nothing more than a meta-analysis of polls predicting the presidential outcome. And then, as I mentioned, a Large Hadron Collider, collaboration on correlation structure. So tools for getting thousands of scientists to collaborate on a single probability distribution, highly multivariate, of course, is very inspiring and something that I expect to be important for large-scale studies of very complex diseases. So my last piece I'd like to talk about, I think I'm already significantly over my time, so I appreciate you guys sticking with me. Another very influential thing someone said to me while I was at Facebook is, you know, our job here isn't to predict the future, it's to better see the present. And I think that when people think about investing in my phenotype, they usually think about we're going to get all these great ways to predict the future. But I think that sometimes the money for data management and data analysis can best be spent in understanding the present. So better, more extensive instrumentation, more reliable and more scalable data collection infrastructure, better and scalable data storage, data management, data governance infrastructure. So all that stuff helps you better see the present. And I've discovered this myself as an entrepreneur at Cloudera. You know, we've really had to focus on our data quality about what our customers are doing, and I still feel like we don't do a great job about it. So I can only imagine that in an organization as complex as Mount Sinai, seeing the present is as hard of a problem as predicting the future. So the things that I'd like to do over the next 10 years is I think it's very important to lower the cost of data storage and processing to zero. And what that means is open source software running on open source hardware. You need to remove all of the different proprietary components inside your infrastructure for data storage and processing, which are generating margins for large organizations. You need to collaborate with people who also believe that there's no reason that we need to differentiate ourselves on the container. Let's make the container free. And then once we've done that, we can start moving to measurement and analysis. So the things which populate that container and the things that we use to drive value from that container. So some of my investments, I've invested in about 20 companies myself. Some of my investments are related to this problem of reducing the cost, not just of data storage and processing to zero, but also of measurement and analysis. So I invested in a company which has done some very interesting work on reverse engineering the protocols used to speak to medical equipment. And so they're able to create a programmable lab. So they've built, they've built essentially a REST API into all these different medical devices that they then bought on a secondhand market. So they're all used medical devices with reverse engineered protocols that can be programmed from a single interface. And so they've built this kind of command center for a very low cost a biological lab, and so those kinds of things inspire me. There's also a project at University of Wisconsin, I believe, to build an open source PET scan device. So I think that the more that we can do to just remove all of those proprietary, all that proprietary gunk from the infrastructure for data storage and analysis, as well as measurement and analysis, we'll be better off, because then we can focus in on, well, what data sets do we want to collect, and the people that are actually doing the analysis. And then I think probably the craziest thing that I really do perceive happening is, so there was this great, one of my favorite books when I was a kid was by a guy named David Gelernter. And he's a computer scientist at Yale. And he wrote a book called Mirror Worlds. And it was written in 1992, before even the World Wide Web was well known. And it's incredibly prescient. And he talks about basically, we're going to reach a point where everything in the temporal realm will be instrumented and digitized, and we will then be interacting with it via software. And this is something which has been, and I recently reread this book, and it's remarkable, all the things that he anticipates. And another book that I think this has already been proven out in a lot of places. So another great book that I recently read was called A Vast Machine, and this discusses the evolution of our worldwide infrastructure for the measurement and storage of information about the weather. And so over the past several decades, we've evolved this worldwide infrastructure. It's essentially a global nervous system for hoovering in information about temperature and barometric pressure, et cetera, centralizing it, and then using that to analyze and improve forecasts for weather. And the same thing has happened. Eric likes to talk a lot about disease weather map. There's some folks at the Global Viral Forecasting Institute who have actually built a nonprofit around anytime there's an outbreak, anytime there's a weird virus which starts killing people, those guys go, they sequence it, and they build this database of, hey, these are all the weird viruses which are cruising around hurting people. So we've kind of built this global infrastructure for measurement of viruses. One of my investments is a company called Loku, and I love these guys because they picked a really mundane problem to build out this infrastructure for. So they picked out the problem of, what if you had a single centralized infrastructure of every restaurant menu in the world? What would it take to build that out? What if I wanted to build you a real-time updated, so somebody in Santa Fe, New Mexico decides to change one line, they change the price on their grilled cheese. How quickly can I get that into a centralized database so that I can do analysis over it? And then what does that enable? So they've combined a great number of techniques around crowdsourcing, around social networking, and around predictive modeling, machine learning, to build this infrastructure for very rapidly materializing in a very up-to-date sense restaurant menus around the world. And that same infrastructure can be used to rapidly measure and centralize a wide variety of data. Another great example of this that I really like, because the data itself is open. So Loku is a commercial entity, so unfortunately the data they centralize is not accessible to everyone. However, OpenStreetMap is an amazing foundation, and actually a lot of mapping companies which are competing with Google are starting to use OpenStreetMap for their reference data set. So this is a data set about every street in the world which has been collected by just individuals, most of whom are not employed by this nonprofit. And so I think that right now we as a society are undergoing this, there's a new manifest destiny. So rather than kind of from sea to shining sea, it's sort of like from atom to shining bit. Like we're going through this process of turning the material world into the digital world. And it's completely impossible to stop. Like, this is the world we live in, and you can either be riding the wave, or you can be complaining about it and just getting washed up. And what's remarkable to me is where this is penetrated first. So looking at things like weather and seeing that we already have this remarkable global infrastructure, and then looking at something like health and recognizing that we don't. And if I think about the fact that there are servers at Facebook about which the world knows more than my body or your body or anyone's body, it's very frustrating to me. We've not invested nearly as much, I think, in the digitization of a human being as we've invested in the digitization of many other things in the world. So I think that it's very important that we recognize that this is happening, and we allow this, and we get in front of the trend, and we allow it to happen in a way that we believe in. So there's, in American history, there's a very famous guy who wrote about something called the frontier thesis, where he felt that a lot of the American character was shaped by the fact that we had this frontier to explore. And I think that a lot of the character of the institutions that are going to be successful in this new world will be shaped by this frontier of data that needs to be of the world that needs to be digitized. But I also think it's very important that we recognize this is a morally ambiguous problem that we're working on. So obviously, the fact that America pushed out native inhabitants of its lands in the process of fulfilling its manifest destiny was something that wasn't widely discussed at the time, but in retrospect is something that I think a lot of people regret and wish we had done more tactfully. And I think that there are many challenges as we work through this process of digitizing reality that we'll be faced with as a society, and we can't ignore that it's happening. We need to address the fact that it's happening and try and prevent some of these regrettable outcomes from occurring. And I really urge anyone who's interested in this problem to read. There's an epilogue in Mirror Worlds, which is a discussion between a computer science professor and a humanities professor. And it's a humanities professor voicing his concerns about, okay, I believe you that Mirror Worlds will happen, but I don't think it's a good thing. Here are all the things that I'm concerned about. And I think that those concerns are very real. And they're not just concerns about a violation of privacy, but they're genuine concerns about our actual engagement with physical reality and our ability to feel things like emotion. So, I think that we live in remarkable times, and I'm very excited to be part of a remarkable organization in Mount Sinai, which is, I think, devoted to riding this wave and not just complaining about it. And I look forward to working with all of you and hopefully enabling many of you to enable Mount Sinai to capture as much value as we can from this process. Thank you for your time.
We're actually running a little bit behind. Maybe you have time for one quick question. Okay, well, then I'll ask for everyone, and then you can get off the stage. So do you see any fundamental difference between healthcare data and the other data you've looked at?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I haven't looked at healthcare data enough to know in great detail the differences, but the primary difference that I see is the problem of sort of structured taxonomies or ontologies or controlled vocabularies. So the fact that in healthcare, there are all these entities about which we'd like to speak, and we want to make sure that we're using the same language across different organizations. So that whole problem of sort of taxonomy integration or the semantic web, what have you, I think is very real in biology, and it wasn't as real for me in the web domain. So I think that's a very unique feature of biological data. And the fact that there are entire classes of entities about which we don't even know. So things like the germ theory of disease. We didn't even know germs existed until there was some biological research. So I'm excited to be part of a world in which we might discover that we've been looking at the wrong locus of agency. So those are the two biggest differences I see.
So do you have a theory about why our field, biomedicine, healthcare delivery, has been so far behind when it comes to being part of the data revolution?
Yeah, because failure hurts a lot more here. I think if you push an update to Facebook, so I'll never forget the day that I was at Facebook, and we pushed an update so there are these caches which make it faster to serve your data back out to you. But those, and we accidentally removed, essentially, you started seeing data out of the caching system which wasn't yours. So people were seeing messages that weren't theirs, et cetera. And it was a huge issue. And I would actually been working, it was literally the morning the next day, I'd worked through the entire night. And I just remember just sitting in the chat rooms just being like, holy cow, this is a really bad thing. But we rolled it back, and you guys probably don't even know that happened, right? But if something like that happened in medicine, I mean, the institution itself could be called into question. So I think that the biggest reason that things haven't happened in the biomedical domain is simply that outcomes matter a lot more. I'll also never forget the day after I left Facebook that I went and sat inside of Navigenics' office, and I looked at some ROC curves. So in predictive modeling, ROC curves are how you evaluate the quality of the predictive model you've built. And I had been looking at ROC curves for the last several years about basically click-throughs on ads, and those were really boring, and I didn't care about them at all. And these guys had ROC curves for predicting whether or not someone was going to survive a cancer treatment. And I just remember just being like, wow, I feel like I would try so much harder and be so much more interested in this problem if my ROC curves were looking at outcomes like whether or not someone had lived or died. So I think that I don't think that I don't think it's a failure of the biomedical domain for not having innovated in this infrastructure because the outcomes matter a lot more. I think it would be a failure of the biomedical domain not to learn from and borrow from the innovations of other worlds.